Hey everyone, I'm going to be talking about the climate justice nonprofit 350.org, which I'll refer to as just 350. In this presentation, I'm going to, in the first part, just give a general overlay of the organization and what they work on and what differentiates them. And then in the second part, I'll do a little bit of an evaluation and a little bit of a critique. So some general information about 350.org. It was founded in 2008 by Bill McKibben along with several others, and it's named after 350 parts per million, the acceptable amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's largely been very essential to the development of the grassroots climate movement over the last 10 years or so. It is very climate justice focused, so it doesn't just want to, get off of, stop climate change and, get off of fossil fuels. They really prioritize that the most vulnerable communities be protected. And as such, they have a very large focus on diversity in their organization and within the campaigns they support. It is largely a grassroots organization. The whole organization is comprised of numerous local chapters across many different countries, mostly focused on local campaigns, supported by a core paid staff of around 120 people. 350 has three broad areas of focus, the first being the build-out of renewable energy, the second being halting of new fossil fuel development, and the third being divestment and defunding of fossil fuel projects. These goals are acted upon through numerous smaller local campaigns rather than a big national campaign like, by comparison, the Sunrise Movement's push for a federal Green New Deal. 350 plays a big role in turning people out for larger climate marches that are more visible, like the Keystone protests and the Climate Strike Week, but most of their day-to-day work is in these local campaigns, and that relates to their theory of change, which is that the transition will come from the ground up. The politics and the culture will change from many small local fights and communities. On their website it says, each and every success will both add momentum to this growing movement and chip away at the fossil fuel industry's ability to operate and expand. Getting a little more into their first demand, 350 advocates for the build-out of renewable energy that is available for everyone at the local level. They do this by supporting campaigns that urge local institutions to make pledges and adopt resolutions about switching to their cities and towns and so on to renewable energy. Often the institutions they use as their targets are ones with symbolic and often actual power, like local city councils and so on. Their idea is that the change will start at the local level and go up from there to state and national governments. They're very dedicated to the idea of a just transition that does not leave behind fossil fuel workers, and making sure that historically marginalized communities also enjoy the benefits of the new renewable energy age. This is part of their goal, their overall strategy of building local community power from the bottom up so that the climate movement is everywhere and is a widely recognized force in society. And they believe that power is in creating a long-term and committed climate activists who become committed because their fights are connected to their places of life, their communities. On the principle of keep it in the ground, which holds that in order to transition from fossil fuels, we need to stop immediately further development that will keep us locked into their use. 350 fosters local fights against the new development of oil, gas, and coal. Their efforts here range from attempting to achieve symbolic resolutions from local governments or actual legal bans where it's possible as well on various forms of fossil fuel development, anywhere from the refinement, the transportation, or the use of other resources for fossil fuels. And they also fight specific projects and proposals like the Richmond refinery of Chevron in the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area. A major win was the 2018 victory of 350 Brazil in Peruíbe against which would have been one of the largest power plants in the world at the time. That's a coal-fired plant, I believe. One of the things that 350 has been best known for relates to their third goal of divestment. Their Go Fossil Free divestment campaign, which has been going on for years now, has been responsible in part for kicking off the global divestment movement, which has now seen $40.5 trillion divested from major institutions, including universities, city pension funds, other sorts of foundations. The idea here is both economic, to deprive funding for new development of fossil fuels, but also to remove the cultural legitimacy given to this industry by institutions within our society. Along with this effort is the work to have museums and other cultural institutions like sports teams and so on break their sponsorships with fossil fuel companies, as well as the effort to urge banks and financial institutions to stop funding fossil fuel projects. According to the 2021 financial report, 350 received about half of its funds from individual donations, and the other half, a little bit less, from grants and foundations. Here is a list of most of the foundations that donate to 350. Counted here, there's around 100 of them. But I do think that this figure here of how much it is donation-based does speak to the grassroots nature of the organization. Turning now to my evaluation, 350 has very clearly played a major role in developing the global grassroots climate movement and changing public consciousness around climate change. Their divestment campaign has been a major tool in achieving this, and I think it has been very successful. If you look merely at the numbers from 2015, there was only a 1.5 trillion committed in divestment versus now, just a short amount of time later, that number has grown exponentially. And you can compare that number to the 2.7 trillion invested by banks between 2016 and 2020 to get a sense of how massive it is. This campaign has changed moral expectations around institutions and banks about where they put their money, and one of the most momentous events has been the Harvard University's decision to withdraw their investment out of their endowment in fossil fuels, which has led to a backlash from industry representatives that have been pushing for laws in certain states to basically prohibit divestment. But I think that backlash speaks to the success of the movement. And here you can take a look at what kind of institutions have been divesting, many educational, many faith-based, and many government as well. To provide some constructive criticism commentary, I'll zero in on 350 Portland, where I live, 350 PDX's campaign against Zenith Oil, which attempts to stop their expansion of their oil by rail operation. This campaign has been going on for several years, and there's been many instances of back and forth within the city. At one point, the city denied the key land use permit, but this was just recently reversed, and it gave the project a green light to go ahead. 350 is a long game of building the movement through many smaller local fights and victories over time. But when many of these victories get reversed, like in this situation, it leaves me questioning if the tactics used, like phone calls and lobbying and testimony and so on, are enough to achieve lasting, irreversible gains, like a permanent ban on a given project or fossil fuel type. I think that 350 has been absolutely indispensable in terms of getting the climate movement to where it is today, and I think their ongoing work is necessary, but perhaps not sufficient. Given how little time there is left to secure the possibility of limiting warming to between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius, we must quickly find a way to successfully demand sweeping national policies. Some argue that what we need is more numbers. We need a critical mass of people, of society involved in protesting and so on, and that there are certain strategies and tactics that can be used to get massive numbers of people involved very quickly. Others argue that what we really need is actually greater pressure from a more radical flank of the movement. Proponents of the radical flank strategy, like Andreas Malm, for example, believe that disruptive acts of civil disobedience by an increasingly radical section of the movement could make it so that the demands of the less radical section, like 350, are more palatable to those in power, and that to avoid the risk of growing involvement in this radical section, political leaders may make concessions to the so-called mainstream section of the movement. I think it makes quite a bit of sense, and I think given how strong the mainstream movement has become, they could point to this kind of other section and say, well, hey, if you don't want things to develop to that point, you should really start to take us more seriously, which is the idea. An example would be the Ende Gelände movement in Germany, and as you can see here, they use tactics like this kind of massive swarming of infrastructure that has a real material impact on shutting down operations and costing money and so on. In conclusion, I do think that 350's goals are well articulated and that they are realistic and achievable in the context of a more radical flank emerging that makes them appear, again, more palatable and acceptable and necessary for leaders to act upon. Only then will the strategies that 350 uses to meet its goals of local campaigns and so on and divestment really become successful. Only if, however, that radical flank remains nonviolent towards people and individuals' property. The idea is not that one approach is better than the other, but that the one is necessary for the other to succeed. And I would hope that if the time came, 350 would use its voice to not disavow that other flank, but to instead point to it to reinforce its own its own demands. And that is how those demands will finally be met by the powers that be in the world, by decision makers, lawmakers, politicians, and so on. That's how they will finally take seriously this movement and be accountable. And that's not to say that the mainstream section of the movement, 350 which represents it, and other groups adjacent to it, must of course continue to build power, to bring people in, to grow the numbers of people in the movement. But it's this added element that will really give that the power that it needs to have its demands be met. And this is not a new idea either. Andreas Malm, for example, again, writes about how in previous struggles, like in the civil rights movement, there would not have been, for example, like a Martin Luther King without the role of someone like Malcolm X in a more radical strain that made King's demands more acceptable. And this goes for other movements for justice throughout history too, like the apartheid struggle, anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, or so Melm and others argue. But in any case, at the end of the day, 350 has been a tremendously important organization that's worth supporting and being involved with. Okay, that's the end. Thank you very much.